now we get to really talk about Chardonnay. So, California Chardonnay is an interesting topic for discussion, either as punchline or beyond. I would argue, obviously, we're going to go well beyond. It is in the middle of what I call in the book a comeback tour, which is a line somewhat appropriated from a guy named Matt Licklider, whose wines we had a little earlier and which are out there, the Lyoko wines. The other way I would say it is California Chardonnay is in the middle of a third wave. The first wave being some very great wines, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but some really great and important wines that were made in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, when there was very little Chardonnay in California, and it was really something of a specialist's grape, and there were just a handful of people who were obviously all inspired by Burgundy, and were willing to figure out how you could make this grape, of which in the 1960s there were generally less than 200 acres in all of California, into a great wine. The second wave being what happened after, which was that it went from being a serious grape to a pop grape, and became the base material for wines that were meant for not just for a mass market, but for a mass market that often hadn't really drunk wine before, and that was just learning how to drink wine, at least in the United States, and so found a sort of mildly sweet, inoffensive beverage that they could enjoy, and that was just basically a synonym for white wine. And I guess the second and a half wave would be this sort of slight reactionary phase to that, when a number of winemakers wanted to simply put Chardonnay into stainless steel, block mallow, come up with these somewhat sort of anemic, hard wines that would occasionally be interesting, but would often be just rigid and a little bit overly strict to drink, would be the nice way to say it. So we're now in this place where I think we're back to what Chardonnay can do in California, which is why everyone who's up here today is here, which is that as the great telegraph of place, certainly among white grapes, with Riesling also in that mix, but as the great telegraph and interpreter of place, that we're now back to an opportunity for California to look at what it can do with Chardonnay. So as I mentioned just quickly, in the mid-60s there were less than 200 acres. Within 40 years that has grown to, 45 years that's grown to almost 100,000. And if you want to look at what the pivot point was, it was 1982, and it's when a wine called the Vintner's Reserve Chardonnay from Kendall Jackson, which is a small winery essentially based in Lake County at the time, debuted, and it was a little richer, a little bit sweet. It was meant to get people to believe that rather than going and buying a blended wine or buying Mountain Chablis or whatever else there was, that they could go and buy a grape based on its name, and that Chardonnay, actually, for what it was a premium product. So within a decade, within really about 7 or 8 years, California Chardonnay went from this connoisseur's wine to, again, a pop wine. So what happened there is obviously about style, but it's also about the market. And so one of the things I think we're going to have to confront today is exactly what Chardonnay should be, and whether it should be something of a simple populist wine, which, to be fair, has great market power, and for better or worse, to sell a California Chardonnay in any style is, as I'm sure Steve would attest, a somewhat easier endeavor than trying to sell, say, a California Ribolla Gialla.
Yes.
But but at the same time, when it becomes that, can it serve a greater purpose? Can it serve the purpose of the base material for terroir-driven wines? So I'm going to leave it there and introduce everyone who's up here. All the way to my left, your right. I can't imagine that Jancis Robinson needs introduction. She obviously does not have a wine up here, but ultimately we'll taste the wines a little bit, and then she is going to offer a perspective, I think, on not simply Chardonnay, but on California and its trajectory over time in general, and also I think specifically within the UK market, and how Britain and how the rest of the world has viewed California wine. To my immediate left, Rajat Parr, who has a number of labels, one of which is Sandhi, the other of which is Domaine de la Cote. Of them, Sandhi contains the Chardonnays that he makes, all from Santa Barbara County, and in addition to a role as a winemaker and winery owner, Rajat also is one of the most well-known and accomplished wine directors in the United States, as the, still for the moment, wine director of the Michael Mina Group. And also probably knows more about Burgundy than just about anyone in the U.S. So when he makes Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, it does not come from an uninformed perspective in a larger context. Directly to my right, Steve Matthiasson, who, in addition to being one of the most accomplished viticulturists in Napa, also makes wines under his own label with his wife Jill, including Ribolla Gialla. That wasn't a random example, but also Chardonnay. And one of the things I'm hoping he'll talk about is the drive to want to make this particular grape, certainly from Napa. And finally, all the way again to your left, Ellie Patterson, who with her husband Jeffrey own Mount Eden Vineyards. And if you know anything about the history of California Chardonnay, it is inextricably intertwined with Mount Eden, namely in the form of this vineyard that was founded by a man named Martin Ray, who really, along with Paul Masson, in a direct lineage, sort of within this very specific place in the Santa Cruz Mountains, offer the full history of Chardonnay in California, which I'm hoping Ellie will tell us about in better detail than I can give. So, Raj, do you want to start and tell us a little bit about your work with Sandhi and with the Sanford and Benedict?
So, like the same story as many people in California. So, I've been a sommelier since 1996, and that was around the time when the big opulent style was just taking off in the restaurants. Everyone was enjoying the big, creamy, even the unfiltered style, and it was, and early on in my career, I was lucky to be introduced to Burgundy, and I used to go to Burgundy every year, and I could never drink California Chardonnay. One late night, I was challenged by a friend of mine. He said, "You can't make California Chardonnay, which is going to be crisp and fresh and vibrant." And I'm like, "Okay, I can try." So I started looking for vineyards around California, and I came back to the wines of Au Bon Climat, Jim Clendenin. So I was like, "Wow, these wines have freshness and vibrancy." And he was a good friend at the time, as my mentor. So I asked Jim if he would help me out. I said I would love to get some grapes from Sanford Benedict. And the reason I was attracted to the vineyard was it was ahead of its time. It was planted in the middle of nowhere. There were no vineyards around it. It was planted in 1971 on their own roots. It was dry farmed and organic, which is in today's world almost no one would do that. So I told Jim, I would love to make it with him and get, a couple of tons, and I'll give you the barrels, and we'll press it together and just, let's see what we can do. And I want to call it the pick. So he worked I did 5 years with Jim, practicing and trying to kind of see how the we didn't farm the vineyards or anything. It was just totally a experimental project, just to kind of see if we can make fresh wines without any additions of natural acidity, ambient yeast, just straight Chardonnay in older barrels. And did that for 5 years, and then we said, okay, so now we can at least scratch the surface. And then we decided, me and Sashi, to start Sandhi along with Charles Banks, my business partner. And that was in '09 when I was still working in the restaurant, but I was slowly kind of thinking I'm going to slide away from the restaurant world and focus on making Chardonnay. Sandhi was born on the idea of making Chardonnay. And then, of course, being a Pinot nut, now we make Chardonnay and Pinot, and now we also Domaine de la Cote estate vineyard, which Sashi planted in '06 and '07. So, this vineyard is a very unique vineyard. This
isn't just an interesting vineyard. This is the mother vineyard for Santa Barbara.
Yeah, it's kind of comes back in a way. It's the clone which they planted there was called Wenti, which was a suitcase clone brought in from Burgundy in the 60s, and then it was facing north. I mean, who plants a vineyard facing north? But they did, and so it gets amazing. The afternoon sun only, a lot of fog, and the soil is silex. It's silica based, but it's silex, and they have tiny clusters, and you get these amazing, vibrant levels of acidity. Which, on the first time we made it, we were like, wow, how can you make Chardonnay with 11 grams of acid? But it works. This wine we baked at around 10 grams. 11 we had outside is 11 and a half grams, and they're like crazy numbers. Finished pHs are somewhere around like 3.1, and on paper it makes no sense because it's like it's not like we're copying a style of any one producer. It's just like the raw product is so good in that area. So Sandhi focuses on all its Chardonnays from one road. All our vineyards are right next to each other. Some are on high level silica, some are lower level, some have more clay, some have pure diatomaceous. I have some rock samples out there in the tail if you want to check it out. It's just, and again, vinification is nothing, my mentor in Burgundy, Jean-Marc Rouleau, so I like the style, so I spend time with him and kind of like, try to understand how he vinifies. Only vinification is, it's crushed, it's pressed, no sulfur. We usually don't have sulfur to the wine, usually 10, 11 months, gets one racking into a tank, 6-7 months stainless steel tank, fined and bottled. There's no...
You should probably mention what this is fermented in, though.
They're fermented in a large 500-liter tonneau, and we get a very high degree of fermentation. So we are almost at, say, 32 degrees Celsius. So my idea is to burn the fruit, because it's like in California, we get this, like, Chardonnays have pineapple and all these. We have enough sun in California, so for Chardonnay, I want to kind of take the fruit away and make it like, what the vineyard gives you the soil is, which is pure silex, very rocky soil. And I think in the big vessel, we get that kind of high temperature, of course, ambient yeast, and just, it works. This is, that's all there is.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the Santa Rita Hills and just sort of where it's at, what attracted you to it?
Yeah, it's, again, acidity, freshness, vibrancy, those three things. People say, why not Sonoma? Why not, anywhere else? I bought some grapes from Sonoma one year. I did Oregon a couple years, Anderson Valley with Wells in 04, 05. So, I think the high levels of acidity, and the freshness, and also being in an area where the generally most people pick 1 month after us. 1 month, like sometimes 6 weeks, and they think I make sparkling wine there. For the first 10, 11, they were like, are you making sparkling wine? Literally, they're like real winemakers walking on the winery, see me sorting, and they're like, is that for sparkling? I said, no, it's like normal wine. And so you can make these crazy wines from the area because you have such high levels of acidity and low pHs. You can pick and make a wine at 16 degrees of alcohol and still retain acidity. We tend to kind of rely more on freshness, and it is what it is. But it's a very interesting area because now there are some more people, except for Jim Clendenin and Adam Tolmack. Everyone used to like pick 1 month after us. So it's just, even sometimes we are done with our ferments, they're dry, we're barreling down, and there's still tons of grape out there. So, it's a young appellation, and I think that, people are going to kind of figure it out some point. It's very, very new. The appellation was formed only in '03. I got there in '04, so this was my 10th harvest in 13 vintage, and looking back, opening bottles from '04 and '05, they're still a very fresh and very primary.
So just quickly, having started your trajectory at this point where everything was sort of opulent and lees worked and all intending to be cream and barrel and what have you. So what is your view of what California Chardonnay should be, can be?
I think California is so diverse with different soil types. I think if everyone focuses inwards into what they have in their own vineyard and their own soil and their own microclimate, that'll define California as own. Because it's tough to say, there's a great vineyard in California. Where you have California, you have in Napa, Sonoma, Anderson Valley, and then we are way down south. We are almost in the same latitude as North Africa. So we have to think differently. We have to think about north-facing vineyards. We have to think about ways we can, manage a canopy, we're shading it, not kind of just pulling all the leaves to kind of retain freshness, and ways to kind of manage viticulturally of how we can make fresh and vibrant wines. Luckily, we are not getting hotter weather patterns. We are, in fact, getting cooler weather patterns, even though it's dry this last 2 years, but definitely is, like temperature-wise, in this vineyard, Santa Benedict, it might get to 32, 33, 34, maybe. Not more than that, maybe for 1 or 2 days. At our estate vineyard, we almost never get over 32 degrees Celsius, and it's just, everyone thinks Santa Barbara is sunny and hot, but it's like almost always fogged in all the way till 9, 10 a.m. We have sunlight for 5, 6 hours, and then again the fog comes back in. It's
Yeah. I will say one thing that always astonishes me with this wine, regardless of what one thinks in terms of its style, and I love this wine, but is the level of dry extract, which I think is the vineyard. It's something that Sanford Benedict in particular can do. One, probably because of vine age, and two, yeah.
These wines are like 5 feet tall in some parts. Some parts are like 3 feet tall. Wines, it's like old school canopy from California. It's a sprawl. It's not, it's not the good Coron and stuff. It's just like free for all, and that tells you that this vineyard is, it's all about the vineyard and nothing else, because we make the other Chardonnays from the same appellation right next to these vineyards, and they have a different character. Of course, same kind of the extract and on paper the numbers are very similar, but it just tastes different. It's just I don't know. We don't.
Can I be desperately nerdy and just point, because I've got the bottle here, if that's the correct bottle, it's actually 2011 rather than 2012, as said on the tasting sheet. That's all right. I just didn't want people to be confused.
So 2011, yeah. So 2011, spring frost, very low yield. We usually make 12 barrels. You see, we made, I think, 7 barrels maybe from the vineyard. It's just it was a very cool vintage, and I guess this is a vintage which was, when the numbers came in with the juice samples, it said 11.7 grams of acidity, and we're like, what the hell is this? How are you gonna what are you gonna do with this? And but we didn't. We luckily went through alcoholic and malolactic. It took 11 months, and so that's why the wine has slight reduction, because of the late mallow and because the sulfur addition was 11 months. That's the reason it has that kind of that matchsticky reduction, which I happen to love. But
Steve, do you want to introduce Matthiasson generally and the Linda Vista in particular?
Okay. So, let's see. I started working in vineyards about 20 years ago, and started with Chardonnay about 4 years ago, I guess, with the wine. So I was working with Chardonnay for a long time, thinking about it, and it had not occurred to me to make it partly because when Raj talked about the sort of switch to the more opulent style of wine around 96, somewhere between 96 to sort of 2003 is when that sort of began and ended. And I sort of lived through that and had started working in vineyards just sort of before that. And so, and in California, you don't tend to have the vigneron model where you have the certain person farming grapes and making wine. It's pretty unusual. So you mainly have people that grow the grapes and then someone else makes the wine. They're not the same person. And and in many cases, most wineries are buying grapes from a grape farmer, basically. And so I was on the grape farming side. And on the grape farming side, we pretty much universally hated that transition to the riper, more opulent style because the winemakers were all of a sudden out tasting grapes and picking stuff really a lot later than what they had before. And the fruit, as you can imagine in the fall, the fruit hanging out there longer, the weather is continuing to affect the fruit. We don't get late fall rains as much, but we get dry north winds that really dry the fruit up in the fall, and it breaks your heart to work all year to grow beautiful fruit and then have it just get all shriveled up and sunburned and raisiny and crappy. And there was a very much a sense of lack of control. It shifted from, you didn't know, the winemakers didn't know what they were doing. This is uncharted territory for them, picking stuff this ripe. And we didn't know what they were thinking. And so it was a very negative, on the grape growing side, we were very negative about this newer way of making wine. And I was a home winemaker, but not doing anything commercially with wine. And so by 2003, it's just sort of codified, like this isn't going away. Like this is the new way of doing things. And at that point, I'd been making wine, at home for 10 or 11 years, and decided, we're going to go ahead and throw our hat in the ring and turn some of this fruit into wine. And I'm not going to see this fruit get spit on it basically anymore. What it felt like. And so we started 2003, and then we started with a Merlot and Cab blend because we were in Napa Valley. And again, I didn't come out of the restaurant world, so my knowledge of world wines was fairly limited. And so you're in Napa Valley, you make Cab and Merlot. And but then I had one of the people whose vineyard I was managing was George Vare, and he was a real vet in the industry, had been in the industry for many decades, but hadn't sort of, most of these guys, old war horses like that, had run lots of wineries and run distributorships, or they give me some scotch. It's just, they're very cynical about it. But George, his way of dealing with having been in the business for way too long was falling in love with Friuli, because he loved the characters that were in Friuli, and that place represented to him what wine was all about, and what California wine had been about when he started in the business, before it became about numbers, basically. And so he brings this Ribolla Gialla budwood on the airplane with him and shows it to me, and we graft it in the vineyard, and I'd never heard of Ribolla Gialla, and so we start figuring out how to grow it. And Abe Scherner is a California winemaker that's very sort of iconoclastic, and Abe was making his wine, so we were skin fermenting Ribolla Gialla and stuff, and I'd never heard of that either, skin fermenting a white wine, 10 years ago. And so we traveled to Italy and to research Ribolla Gialla, and I was totally blown away by the white wines, and how every producer we went to would say freshness, freshness, freshness as part of how they described their wines and their goal with their wines. And I came back to California, and that fall in 2005 sat on this panel that was, the topic was high impact winemaking, the grapes past 25 bricks. And I was the vineyard guy. They'd asked to be on the panel to talk about viticultural aspects of growing grapes past 25 bricks.
Is this the grape growers?
No, this was Vincari put it on in Sonoma. And so I tried to give a talk on ways of growing the grapes that you don't have to get to 25 bricks. And it just, didn't go over very well. And the and I was talking about freshness because I had just learned this term, freshness, but at that point I didn't consider myself a winemaker. I was still a vineyard guy that was muddling through making wine. And the other guy on the panel who was a winemaker says, "What do you mean? What do you mean freshness?" That was a completely novel concept. That was not a goal. It was not a goal in winemaking, was freshness. And so we started making our white blend in 2005, and that was my goal, was freshness. I said, this is what I want to do. I've seen the light. I kind of confirmed that trip to Italy, sort of put a lot of pieces together that I'd kind of been figuring out on myself working in vineyards, but hadn't understood as a sort of codified knowledge about wine. And so
So what was in the white blend?
the white blend was Ribolla Gialla, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, and Tokai Friulano.
So how did you get from there to Linda Vista?
Well,
Chardonnay?
that's a blend, and so now we're talking Chardonnay. And Chardonnay has, so it was also very, for me as a winemaker, it was playing with the obscure varieties and doing things on my own. Was there was no tradition, there's no basis, so it was freeing But then you go to Chardonnay, and Chardonnay is a world grape. It's very clear what the great examples of it are in different parts of the world, and so it's a very different mentality. With Chardonnay, you have to respect. At least I felt like you have to respect the tradition of Chardonnay and what that variety signifies. It's when Etienne Monti visited last year. I think he told him to come and visit, and he swung in, and I tasted him on our white blend, and he goes, "Wow, you've created something." He goes, "I've never created a wine in my life. I try to reveal with my wines," and so that's really what I'm trying to do with the Chardonnay. Is respect the variety and respect the site and try to reveal on this one. So it's just get out of the way, basically.
And just quickly locate us on where Linda Vista is.
So Linda Vista Vineyard is the mouth of the Napa Valley. So the Napa Valley, the ocean off San Francisco is very cold, and we have a very cold ocean current upwelling and that's what defines the weather of the foggy San Francisco. And so as the warm inland areas of the western United States heat up and the hot air rises, that pulls cold air in off of the ocean, and the Northern California weather is cool because of this cold air getting pulled in. So we get the fog pulled in the afternoon, we get sea breezes. Napa Valley is long and skinny, and so the further up the valley you are, the further away you are from the bay, and the warmer it is. So it can be 20 degrees difference in the summer from the southern part of the valley to the northern part of the valley. So we're right at the mouth of the valley. So where the Linda Vista Vineyard is, alluvial soils have come down off the hills, right near the hills. Morning fog, sunny afternoon, and then late afternoon you get a breeze coming in off the bay. So it was a classic Chardonnay area before, I'd say from the 60s and 70s, because Chardonnay wasn't really planted in Napa Valley until the 60s, much at all.
Or anywhere.
Or anywhere, yeah. And in the 60s and the 70s, this Oak Knoll, the western side where this vineyard is, was where they started planting Chardonnay. And then, because it was a cooler area and you couldn't get reds ripe down there at that time with the virus and old viticultural techniques. And then now that's red country because the price of Cabernet and Chardonnay is down in Carneros, which is a little bit closer. But very different soils in Carneros are very clayey, whereas these are more alluvial.
But behind your house would have also been
behind the house, yeah.
So this is literally the vineyard is right behind Steve and Joseph's house.
Yeah.
So Ellie, introduce us to Mount Eden.
Okay.
This is a very important place within the history of California.
Well, Mount Eden does have a long tradition with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It was founded by Martin Ray. He moved there from Paul Masson. He owned Paul Masson for 7 years. This is about 50 miles south of San Francisco, what's now called the Santa Cruz Mountain Appellation. That appellation was the first mountain appellation in California, started in 1981. And a number of French vintners moved to the Santa Clara Valley and Santa Cruz Mountain in the late 1800s. So you actually had quite a bit of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir planted at that time. During and after Prohibition, many of those small vineyards went away, but Martin Ray actually knew Paul Masson as a boy, ended up buying the property from him after Prohibition, and Paul Masson told Martin he really shouldn't buy Paul Masson, he should move to the mountain to the north, which is the current Mount Eden site. Martin decided that he wanted to buy the Paul Masson property anyway. It specialized in champagne at the time, sparkling wine, and eventually sold it to Seagram's and did do what what Paul suggested, which was to go one hillside to the north and plant Mount Eden. He started in 1943, first planting Pinot Noir, and in the late 40s, Chardonnay, and also into the 60s. So we have had this long tradition of Chardonnay on our site. The theory is that the budwood came from possibly Louis Latour's vineyard, Corton Charlemagne, because he was a good friend of Paul. No one knows for sure, but what we do know is that the Mountain Eden Chardonnay tends to be longer aging, tends to have a little bit more minerality and length than your typical Mount Eden Chardonnay. We do make Chardonnay from other sites. They don't seem to have this characteristic, so we do believe that the site does make a difference. We're about 600 meters above the Santa Clara Valley. We overlook Apple and all of Silicon Valley. It's a kind of a viticultural island. We don't have vineyards next to us. The soil is Franciscan shale, and from the years of farming since the 40s, most of that topsoil has left, so we're dry farmed. The clonal selection, called the Mount Eden clone, is very small clusters, a lot of shot berries, very small yields. I think that the personality of the wine tends to be, again, more mineral, more soil driven. Santa Cruz Mountains in general tends to have, throughout all the varietals, which are Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cabernet, a little bit more of a savory quality and not so fruit driven.
One thing to note, which is just because you will often hear people talk about Wente and the Wente clone, which came into the country theoretically around 1912, and has become sort of the base material for most of it. So one thing to note with Mount Eden, in addition to the lineage, is that genetically it's a very different heritage, and sort of one that is less well known in California, but I think equally important. Then do you want to tell us just quickly a little bit about the winemaking?
Okay, well, my husband has been in the cellar doing the winemaking since 1981. So you have the same site and the same winemaker for quite a long time. Typically, the Chardonnay is brought in and barrel fermented, goes through full malolactic indigenous yeast. It stays in the barrel for about 10 months. We don't do any stirring. When Jeffrey first got there, he did a little bit for a few years and found that wasn't really necessary. So we do use about 1-year-old barrels, 50% and 50% new.
And then how long is it in bottle typically before?
Well, because we believe that it should be a long aging wine, we do hold it in bottle for a number of years. We try and wait 2 or 3 years before release. What you have here is the 2009, and we've just gone into the 2010.
So our fourth piece of this today is from Jancis, who, like I said, can bring perspective both on Chardonnay and on California. That I think
my perspective is a long one, having been involved with California wine in this market since the late 70s, when I was the honorary secretary of something called the Zinfandel Club, which was formed partly in the wake of Stephen Spurrier, who is here's famous 1976 Judgment of Paris tasting, which made the world realize that California was making seriously interesting wines, a fact that was confirmed in 2006, the 30th anniversary, with another a rerun, which had pretty much identical results. But I just wanted to say, because I think a lot of you maybe haven't been exposed to California wine for all that long, and perhaps have the impression that I got in the last few years that the sort of California wines we were seeing here were either deeply disappointing, very sweet commercial brands, or what looked like rather overpriced, very, very expensive wines that really didn't seem to fit into the marketplace. So, I'm thrilled that Roberson's doing something about this and are presenting us with a whole raft of wines that are nicely filling the gap between those two pricing extremes. Also, of course, being really, really interesting. But I would hate you to think that this is all that Britain has never had a serious relationship with California wine, because in the 80s, California wine was the hot ticket. I remember organising a tasting in the American embassy in the days when you could actually just walk in, as opposed to have to, bring your birth certificate and passport and all the rest and prove that you're not a terrorist. I organised a tasting there of all the California wine in 1980 that was then being brought into the country, and I think there were probably about 20 importers. Admittedly, the dollar-pound rate helped this. It was a very, very favourable at the time, and a lot of people jumped into importing California wine, including my husband-to-be, and that was where I met him. But though it was really interesting, the sort of range of wines that we were seeing. Incidentally, this Zinfandel Club was formed by Harry Waugh, John Avery, and Hugh Johnson were the founders. And they had already, by travelling to California, got really enthused by the sheer quality of wines that were being produced there, which was confirmed by Stephen's tasting. But it wasn't that he put the idea into their head. And we would be tasting then in the 80s some absolutely stunning Cabernets, not at all like the super ripe versions that we were then exposed to, but a much, much wider range of different tastes and varieties, say. As if you were here this morning, John was outlining how narrowed was the range of clones and varieties available in California from about the 90s, or certainly the early years of this century. But then I remember we used a whole raft of Johannesburg Rieslings, even, from places like Chateau St. Jean. Fumé Blanc seemed something rather exotic, and obviously Zinfandel, but just so many more styles. And it wasn't the case that everyone was trying to make a rich, sweet Chardonnay plus a Cabernet that was as ripe as it possibly could be. And I suppose we ought to recognise Geoffrey Roberts, the late Geoffrey Roberts, who did bring in some of the finest wines of California throughout the 80s and early 90s. And we also used to get a wonderful range of producers. I think at that stage, I'm not sure now, there was a sort of nice little help on your air ticket you could get from the whatever the equivalent of the Ministry of Agriculture was. So we'd have an influx of rather glamorously dressed, particularly female California wine producers who used to use it as an excuse for their warm winter wardrobes. But there was a very, very vibrant cohort of lovers of California wine in this country before. And all I'd like to say is that I really hope today will encourage a second wave of that.
So one thing I'm curious about, specifically with Chardonnay, and this came up, we did sort of a Chardonnay intensive last year in Sonoma at Hansel that Julia Harding was at, is that these styles, to get a little bit more perspective. I mean, this is obviously something coming up in California, but I get the sense this is also appearing, say, in Margaret River. This is appearing.
Yes, I mean, I think what will ring a very loud bell for most people here is your reference. Well, I can't remember if you made it this morning or now. To the sort of austere,
the Enoch
anorexic kind of Chardonnays. And we've seen that very strongly from Australia. I think you would agree that we've had a great influx of I mean, the Australians seem to change much more rapidly than those act en masse more rapidly, I think, than California wine producers. And so they seem to go almost within a vintage from being great, big, heavy, toasty Chardonnays to wines that just often had no flavour but were high in acid, that's for sure. And that's been pretty general, whereas it sounds to me as though what you're saying is that in California there's still a big range of different styles of Chardonnay available, which is maybe a good thing. But are you managing to convince people who think that just by making unoaked Chardonnay that's enough? Or
I think we're evolving. I'm curious what other folks think. It's interesting with the Linda Vista because I find that wine appears often in places where they might be more hesitant to be radical, but for whatever reason, the notion of putting a Napa Chardonnay, especially by the glass, on a wine list is comforting and yet radical in its own way.
do people put the word unoaked on labels in California?
Yeah,
A little.
Yeah,
somewhat.
a little bit. All right.
We're talking about with balance with Chardonnay, and it's, to me, Chardonnay is not a very aromatic variety, but it's a variety that's a textural variety, and so it has a voluptuous nature and it has a mineral nature, and part of balancing those two poles is really important with balanced Chardonnay. Like with swinging one way or the other is not. I mean, we're not talking balanced. I mean, it can be stylistic goal, but it's not balanced.
And it needs, I think, also fermentation to build character. It needs, it needs some time. It doesn't need a lot of new oak, but it does need a vessel which is anaerobic, and there's, so it doesn't trap all its fruit. It needs to, I think, in many cases, needs to complete malolactic, so you get that texture in the wine. You get those, and it's not jagged and rough. And I mean, you could of course stop it at some point or not. That's a decision on the vintage, but I think it needs to finish, in my idea, to have that texture.
Yeah, and what's really exciting about all these wines is that they are Chardonnay and they clearly have a great future, and I think we've all got here a little bit worried about being exposed to so much white Burgundy. We've got very worried about white Chardonnay-based wines and their future. But I don't feel any. Are there instances of premature oxidation in California Chardonnay?
Again, I opened a bottle of 05 2 months ago, and I had a couple of older bottles from Aubon Climat recently, also in the late 90s, and they were still very fresh and very vibrant. So.
I would say I don't know that there's a premox issue in California. I would say there is an issue of short lifespans from structurelessness.
But you're talking about the old school.
Yeah. Well, it's
sweet. I mean, sweetness level. We haven't actually mentioned sweetness levels, have we? But presumably, if you were to analyse what was the average California Chardonnay, and compare the residual sugars with these sort of wines, there'd be a big contrast, wouldn't there?
Huge. And it was, I mean, in the same way, with a number of styles, but yeah, it was 5 grams, 5-6 grams, maybe a little more. And that's still very much there. What's happening now is maybe the acid levels are coming up a little. These being not aberrant, but these being, again, that third wave notion that Chardonnay should at least chemically replicate great Chardonnay elsewhere and be dry and have a pH that has the potential for sustainability in the cellar.
Is there any sign that the residual sugar level in mass market California Chardonnay is reducing at all?
I don't see it, but I try to avoid them.
You probably, none of the people here ever taste mass market Chardonnay.
I've been finding ways to escape them.
But it's interesting. We do a little tasting in pursuit of balance. And we in that tasting, we do a kind of seminar. We have a Chardonnay seminar, Pinot seminar, and in the crowd there are a lot of people from some other bigger wineries, and they ask questions in those seminars about how they could, make it, more of like a mainstream Chardonnay. Because if someone is making, 1 million bottles of something which is slightly sweet and they sell out, I mean, it's very hard to convince them, you know what, don't make it, because now your chance you might not sell out. So it's very hard to convince someone who's making a certain style of wine, is getting a certain rating from some people, and the wines are sold out. It's, for us, we are like a very small percentage,
There's a bit of groupthink with the residual sugar issue, only in that I think the folks who believe in it see no reason to change exactly because it has been commercially successful. And yet, when you put a completely dry, and not austere, but dry, it could be a Linda Vista, it could be a Leoka, Sonoma County, what have you, wine into the marketplace, and typically into the hands of anyone except for those people who really are just sort of fixated on a wine tasting like a certain thing all the time. And they tend to like it. I mean, again, this wine is interesting because I think it has been very successful in I won't say obviously a mass market context, but in a commercial context where you're handing people this wine who are simply asking for a glass of Chardonnay. I mean, has that been your
absolutely.
experience?
That's what we found. It's what we found with our white blend, and what we found with this. Continue to find, is that if you give someone a good bottle of wine that's used to drinking sweet stuff 9 out of 10 times, they love it. And so it's they don't, there's this dumbing down that's not, I don't think, is necessary, actually. Balanced wines apply. I really think it's a physiological. I mean, there are wines that are an acquired taste, but in general, I think that we tend to agree on balance because we tend to have similar mouths.
And you guys make more than just the estate wine.
We do. We make a second Santa Cruz Mountain wine. Actually 60% of the estate fruit went into the Domaine Eden wine in 2009. So we pick lots that are tightly wound that will go for longer ageability and have a little bit broader mid palate and length. That's really what we look for. We also make a Chardonnay from Edna Valley, which we've been making since 1985, which is a much more affordable wine, is very consistent, and for me, balance with the sweet wines, they get tiring, and what I look for is something that keep my interest over the course of the wine, or whether it's a glass or a bottle, and that's what we strive for, is that last glass being the best glass, and wanting to come back to it and not wanting to say, oh well, that's the same taste, I'm going for something else.
I think we'll go to some Q&A if that's at all possible, John. Has anybody got any questions? Adam.
It's very interesting, the question of residual sugar in mass market wines, and I think there's the issue of the average dish in the average American restaurant, and what wine goes with that. I'm not talking about the high end. I'm talking about the average $15 to $20 for a main course. These dishes tend to be very, very rich, loaded with masses of different flavors, and you need a very, very big wine to go with that. And I think some of the wines that we're tasting today just wouldn't go with some of those very, very powerful dishes that are the mainstay of restaurants throughout the country.
So these wouldn't go with a bloomin' onion. I don't know. I mean, I suppose it depends how one wants to match food. I mean, part of that is that there are significant gastronomic issues that the United States is confronting. But I mean, I'm curious what anyone else thinks. To me, sort of sugar on sugar is not really the answer, but
that's one of the things I think that's changing. The gastronomy is changing. The whole farm to table concept, back to fresh vegetables, seasonal, those sort of things, lighter, more ethereal type flavors. But definitely that is hand in hand with what we're seeing with changes in wine. And I would say we sell 50% of our wine, our total production, is basically in farm-to-table restaurants. We sell almost nothing to steakhouses, for example. So our wines are delicate, and so there is definitely a pattern there.
I also, just as a quick asterisk, and I know there's a question over here, there's two pieces to the sweetness and the style issue, one of which is the mass market wines, but the other of which is the relatively expensive Chardonnays that are also being made in that style. Because if you're making a $12 or whatever, £4.99 Chardonnay for Tesco, that's one thing. But when you're replicating that style in a what for us would be a $50 bottle of wine, that to me is actually more problematic.
Last year we heard Anne-Claude Leflevre proclaim she thought California was making the best New World Chardonnay. Just wondering if that surprised you or just confirmed what you already suspected, maybe forever. It's for the winemakers, really, I suppose.
Wow. Never heard a compliment from Anne-Claude. No, I haven't heard that. I think now there's a lot of people from the New World. They have been, of course, in New Zealand and Australia and California, going to Burgundy and trying to kind of incorporate some ideas and and maybe they've tasted some wines, but
I want to know who she was tasting.
Yeah.
Well, I must say, I had an HDV the other day that I thought was absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. That would be one that she would have been exposed to.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Same import, Wilson Valley.
And also, and HGB is a good example, and there are a number of them, Kongsgaard being another, and I actually also think the Mount Eden are there. I think that there can be very powerful Chardonnays and and wines that certainly get a share of winemaking that still can show terroir and still can be balanced, and the style issue in Chardonnay to me is more complicated, I think, than simply it either has to be sort of lean, neutral barrels, nothing else going on, or it has to be completely confected.
Just before we wrap things up, a little bird told us that it's somebody's birthday today. So we wanted to wish Jancis many happy returns.
You are
sure
very,
you'll
very
give her a round of applause.
Very sweet.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Lovely. Beautiful. Thank you. Whoops. Oh, God, I think I just ruined my
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to all the winemakers for making the journey over here to speak to us today, and of course to Jon and to Jancis for being part of that as well. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much for being part of it.